Hey everyone, Laser here. Instead of gameplay today, I want to go over something that can be pretty important in card games, and that's playing around cards. And with Mythgard being relatively new, it can be kind of hard to know what to play around when you don't know what the entire card pool looks like. So today we're going to go over what some of the best cards to play around in the game are. For anyone who's not aware, playing around a card means determining whether or not you think your opponent has a certain card, and if so, playing in a manner that minimizes the effect of that happening. So a good example is board clears. Board clears are one of the biggest categories of cards to play around. They can take away your advantage by destroying all of your minions, and usually are the first step to stabilizing for a control deck against something a bit more aggressive. If you are on the beatdown and you're the deck that wants to be putting on pressure, then not overextending into a board clear is really, really important. You want to make them use their board clear in such a way that it really doesn't stop your momentum entirely. You can maybe rebuild afterward, or you have on death effects that are preventing your opponent from really wanting to use the board clear, and you really want to push them into using it in a way that doesn't benefit them nearly as much as it could. In Mythgard, the most common board clears, the ones you'll see on the screen here: Armageddon Angel, Thunderclap, Gigantomachia, Misanthropia, Cataclysm, and Magmatar. These are the ones that, as of right now, I'm seeing most often. If your experience is different, let me know in the comments, but I think these are generally the ones that get to run more than any others. And I think being able to play around these is really important. The good news is most of these have to do with dealing damage and not just straight destruction. Thunderclap, Cataclysm, and Magmatar specifically just deal damage to a certain subsection of minions. Misanthropia will give them minus stats over time. Armageddon Angel and Gigantomachia are the ones that actually just flat out destroy things, albeit Gigantomachia a little bit conditionally. So if you can memorize these cards' costs, their gem investments, and whether or not they're likely to show up in your opponent's deck, then playing around them can really, really make or break the difference. The ones that I see most often are going to be Thunderclap and Magmatar, because they are very, very easy to use and very clear effects, so a lot of beginner decks will include those. Thunderclap, relatively easy to play around. If you're going into turn 4 and you're extending with a whole bunch of creatures that have only 2 health, well, maybe try and play something a little bit beefier. Maybe hold back a little bit and just secure up the board you have now with some buffs. Magmatar can play around it pretty well by just splitting up your minions. Don't put 3 of them next to each other with a low amount of health. And remember, Magmatar also has that 3/3 body behind it, so know that after the 3 damage comes through, you're also going to have to deal with the trade that comes after that. Cataclysm, it's very late in the game, so if you're the aggro deck, you're probably already going to have determined the fate of the game before turn 6, but still, if you haven't, then it's good to make sure that that 5 damage doesn't absolutely demolish your board presence, though Cataclysm is usually only run as a 1 of, so maybe not as important to play around. Misanthropia is played in literally every yellow control deck as a 2 of, so you might want to keep an eye out for that. Gigantomachia tends to only be run in mid-range or control red decks, and aggro red decks are kind of in favor right now, so you may not see this all that often, especially given that it is a mythic rarity, and it's still kind of early in the game's history, so not everyone has full collections, but if you can identify that your opponent is on a more mid-rangey or late-game red deck, you might want to take an eye on it. And Armageddon Angel tends to be run in the vast majority of non-token orange decks, and even sometimes in orange decks as a finisher if you have Soma Oasis, so keep an eye on your opponent's gems, keep an eye on how much mana they have burned, and it can be really, really beneficial if you make sure that you're not playing into a board clear any harder than you feel like you have to. Next up in red, the card to play around is Ignition. Aggro red decks are very, very popular right now as they are cheap and simple and effective, and Ignition is run as a 4 of in probably all of them. It's a very straightforward spell, 1 mana, 1 red gem, deal 2 damage to anyone. It's a relatively simple card to play around because you want to try and either trick trades or only opt into trades where you are either going to survive with more than 2 health, or where you are setting up an ignition kill for your opponent where you're okay with them using a mana on it. Sometimes in the early game, if you set up a kill, if they put down a minion and then you put down, say, an Einjar Thrain, and they can trade into it and then kill it with ignition, and then you don't expect them to have another play, That's fine. They effectively spent their entire turn killing your minion and giving you tempo back because you can play the first minion after that. So sometimes playing into it, playing around a card also means playing into it intelligently. Also note that Ignition can be used just for reach and burn. If you have, 6 health left and your opponent hasn't used any Ignitions and you've pinned them on an aggro red deck, then you really want to start looking to get some healing down, because the odds of them having Ignition or some other burn effects, but usually just Ignition are the big ones, along with rush minions, can really pressure your life total really bad, and you want to make sure that you can play around it as much as possible. Next up in blue, we have Valkyrie Enforcer. Valkyrie Enforcer, 4 mana, 2 blue gems, awaken, return a minion in the opposite lane to its owner's hand. This is a very interesting card in that it has a lot of really good applications, almost all of which are as a tempo tool. If you play something and your opponent bounces it back to your hand, well then they got a 2/2 to basically negate a play that you did. It can be very powerful, especially against Reanimator decks, where when you reanimate something with Hopeless Necromantic, it gets Ephemeral, and if you bounce a card with Valkyrie Enforcer and it has Ephemeral, then it doesn't go to your hand, it's just gone. So Valkyrie Enforcer is a card that is being played pretty frequently right now because those Necromantic decks are very popular. Also, Valkyrie decks are one of the more popular budget decks. Similar to Red Aggro, it is very straightforward in its game plan and very straightforward in how it has to acquire cards in order to make the deck better over time. So, you're going to see this card a lot. So what do you do to play around it? Well, Valkyrie Enforcer is really good at dealing with tall threats, things that are one card that is a lot of stats or a big effect, and basically saying, yeah, that play you just spent all of your turn doing, well, I'm gonna undo it and get a 2/2 for my trouble. If you want to play around it, then a couple things you can do are playing it in a lane that is against a minion. It has to have a minion opposite lane to return, so if you force your opponent to move a creature out of the way in order to put the Enforcer down, well then you just removed a potential attack that they could get through, preserved a little bit of life. It's not ideal, they still get the bounce effect, but you're minimizing the effect of it, which is really what playing around a card is all about. Other thing is, if you are on one of those Necromantic decks, make sure that the turn you're expecting your Necromantic to die and you can get one of those big beaters back out of the graveyard, make sure you have a follow-up play if they do have Enforcer. You don't want to play into a situation where you say, you know what, I'm going to try and get my, let's say, Living Mountain back, and if they can bounce it or remove it, then I just don't have any follow-up and they probably win the game on the spot. Always make sure that you can have at least some sort of follow-up, and maybe hold the Necromantic for a turn or two if you really think that if they have Enforcer, you don't have a way to come back. Another thing that Enforcer is really weak against is on summon effects. If you just dropped your 4/4 Magnus Thorson, well, Valkyrie Enforcer kinda sucks, right? You're giving your opponent another way to just drop that 2 damage to all of your creatures again. It's not good. So another way to play around Valkyrie Enforcer is, if you think that they're going to be looking for one of those tempo plays, prioritize playing your cards with on Enter the Battlefield effects, Awaken effects. Then their Valkyrie Enforcer value is diminished greatly because you're getting another use out of your Awaken effects, and usually those are pretty powerful. So if you think you have your opponent on Valkyrie Enforcer next turn, then Awaken effects are a very good way to play around that. In green, we have Detained, Deported. This is kind of similar to Valkyrie Enforcer, but over a longer span because it's 2 different cards that are kind of attached to each other, and you have to play the Detained first. That said, it's still 4 mana, 2 gems, so it's relatively comparable. That said, this one is at common, so your opponent can run 4 copies of it, and a lot of green decks will do so. Not all, sometimes it's run as a 2 or a 3 of, but it's definitely ubiquitous enough to keep in mind. Detained, give a minion -2/-0 and immobile until your next turn. Add a Deported spell to your hand. Deported, an ephemeral spell that returns a minion to its owner's hand. Very powerful effects. The Detained can trick trades, give it so your opponent has a way to trade favorably and you're kind of just out of luck. And Deported has all of the benefits that are very similar to Valkyrie Enforcer. So How do we play around this? Well, Detained, it's not the biggest deal to play around Detained, I'll be perfectly honest. It is kind of nice to be able to make sure that your positioning is solid enough to where you don't need to worry about the immobile. Oftentimes, if you're worried about an immobilizing effect, it's because your opponent has something that is swift, or your opponent is running the power that allows for an extra free movement. And if that's the case, really you can play around it just by positioning properly the first time, by going directly in the lane across from an enemy minion if that's the correct play at the time. You really have to look at the current situation, but usually Detained is not going to be the biggest deal. Deported, however, we've talked about all of the benefits of bouncing a card already. The difference is, you know when your opponent has deported. It is revealed in your opponent's hand because they have already played the Detained. So one of the most important things to do in Mythgard is play around cards you know for a fact your opponent has. If that's something that they got back from a Journey of Souls proc, or because they got it from another card, such as Deported, it's really, really important to track those cards. Don't play something that you know they can just deport back unless you're willing to say, yeah, if they burn that card, well, not literally burn, but if they use that card, then I'm okay with the tempo hit that comes with. There's a lot of times where that's fine. If you play, again, something like your Magnus Thorson or maybe a Rush minion and you're just saying, well, even if you do bounce back to my hand, I get this beneficial effect for a second time. And remember, bouncing a card, if it is ephemeral, will remove it from the game. It does not go back into your hand. So there are a lot of ways to play around bounce effects, which we've mostly already said, but really what I wanted to highlight with Deported is that it's very, very important to track the cards that you know your opponent has and really account for those in your plays as you go forward, given that they're, already revealed to you. It's free information. You might as well keep it in mind as much as you can. In orange, we have Temptation, my vote for the most difficult card in these ones that I've picked out to play around. In the best case for your opponent, Temptation has two separate uses. One, you have two minions next to each other that could kill each other, you Temptation one and kill both, effectively 4 mana, kill 2 creatures. The other case is you play something on its own, and they steal it and kill you with it for lethal. These are some relatively common scenarios, which makes Temptation a very easy include in most orange decks. It's very, very versatile because it can be used for tricking trades that you have to use 2 creatures over, where they kill one of their own creatures, but kill 2 of yours in the process. They can get around some of your really, really big creatures by getting a little bit of extra damage in with one of yours, effectively getting like a 1.5 for 1. There's just a lot of ways that Temptation can be used, and because of that, it makes it really hard to play around. The good news is there's only 2 of them in any given deck, given that it is at that rare rarity, and also there are some drawbacks to the card. The first thing is that it can only be used on minions with mana cost 5 or less. The other thing is that if it survives, then you get it back reduced by 4, and given that it's at 5 or less, that means it will cost at most 1 to replay. So, how do we play around this one? Well, again, there are 2 cases. The first is your opponent is looking for lethal damage and you've nearly stabilized, but your health is still a bit low. In that case, if you want to play more minions, well, you have to play them in a place where they're not going to be able to swing through for free. That means either playing them next to each other, so if you have one minion, play your new minion next to the old one, and then you can't necessarily get through. And it could also mean holding back a minion with Overrun. If you throw down something with Overrun and your opponent Temptations it, well, they can still punch through for that extra damage, even if you have a blocker. So making sure that you're not setting them up for lethal is very, very pivotal when you put your opponent on Temptation. They haven't already used them in the game. The other use case is as a 1-for-2 removal, stealing one of your minions and trading it into another one of your minions, killing 2 of them in one fell swoop. This is more of a mid-range consideration, turns maybe 4 through 7, where one of you is trying to get board control over the other. And then once you already have, then you start flooding the board a little bit, try and push your advantage. Oh, Temptation. Well, now your board presence is significantly diminished. What do you do? Well, first things first, you have to identify that you're in a situation where board control is important. Sometimes if you just have 2 parser recruits and they temptation them that's 4 mana to kill 2 little guys, that's probably fine, right? That's not something they're likely to go for. Really, the situation is when you guys are throwing haymakers at each other, big minion after big minion, and they want to get that little bit of an edge over you and take away some of that advantage that you've built up over the last little while. To play around it, well, pretty simple. Make it so that your creatures can't attack each other. Play them a little bit further apart, not next to each other in the lanes, or you can choose to prioritize playing minions next to each other that won't die to each other when you actually accomplish the trade. For instance, if you have 2 Archetypes on the field, then sure, they can bump into each other, take each other down to 1 health, but really that's not accomplishing a lot. Now, they may be setting up for something like a Thunderclap if they're on blue-orange tempo, but that's over 2 turns, takes 8 mana, and you can play around that a little bit better given that we already went over the sweepers to play around. So if you can space out your minions appropriately and prioritize playing minions that are less likely to kill each other, then usually Temptation not gonna look so tempting. In yellow, my vote for the card to play around is Meso Libra. A 3 mana, 2 yellow gem, 3/4. Awaken the minion in the opposite lane is stunned until the end of its turn. This card is overstated for its cost and comes down very early, which makes it a really, really good tool in mid-range decks that are trying to get a tempo advantage in the beginning of the game, and also a very, very good tool in control decks because it can slow your opponent down and then make a favorable trade over the course of the next turn. Because of this, it's a really flexible card that finds itself in a lot of decks, which means you're probably going to be seeing it pretty often when you put your opponent on a heavy enough yellow investment to have 2 gems. As always, there are a couple ways we can play around this card if we think our opponent's going to plop it down next turn. First is put the minion that you want stunned the least farther away from your other minions. If you have a nice clump of, let's say again, 2 Archetypes, and you want to drop something like Shatter Fist, well, you want to kind of get at least something to go through, right? If you play the Shatter Fist alongside the Thanes, then the Meso Libra gets to block both of them, and you can't really use the Shatter Fist anytime soon. So instead, you can play the Shatter Fist over on the other side of the board, where sure, it may be stunned, but your opponent still has to deal with the other side of the board, and they've just used half of their mana, if it's turn 6 or 7, on dealing with your Shatter Fist instead. That means they're probably not going to have a great way to answer your Thanes, and you can punch through for a little bit of damage, keep applying pressure. Other way to do it is if you're in a more swarmy deck, then maybe playing it together with your other minions is the right play. That way you can use your token buffs, maybe a Ring of Olama, to clear it pretty easily next turn, and then clear the way for whatever bigger threat, like maybe a Kadeho, you just drop down and they decided to stun. This is one of those cards that playing around it depends very heavily on the kind of deck that you're playing. Meso Libra tends to play very well into tall threats, similarly to Valkyrie Enforcer, so if you have just 1 Haymaker to play, then you kind of lose out on the tempo game because, well, you can't use it next turn, and your opponent probably gets to play something else alongside Meso Libra. So, and maybe you could also prioritize swarming a little bit harder. If you're playing, say, blue-orange, instead of dropping the Shatter Fist, drop a Parsa Recruit or a Xerxian Recruiter. These things can really mitigate the effect that Meso Libra can have because it can only answer one thing at a time, really, in terms of the stun. In terms of trading, if you have ways in hand to trade over Meso Libra in the upcoming turn, then you don't need to be too particularly worried about it. It's really just when you're in one of those mid-range games where you're trying to drop something big and beefy to beat your opponent's face in that Meso Libra really becomes a problem. So identify your game plan and then see whether or not Meso Libra is really going to get too much in the way of it. Lastly, in purple, my nomination is going to be Biting Blade. This is the item that comes off of Sword Saint, the 2 mana, 2 purple gem, 1/1 or 2/1 minion that adds a Biting Blade to your hand. Biting Blade of itself, ephemeral item, costs 1 and no gems, give a friendly minion +1/+0 and life tap. This harkens back to the Detained Deported conversation we had a little bit earlier. Once Biting Blade has been added to your hand, similar to Deported, you know it's in there, so you have no excuse not to be playing around it. If they have to spend the 1 mana to trick a trade and make it favorable, then, well, that clears the way for you to gain tempo back next turn. That gives you priority on playing the first minion after the trade has been accomplished in the early game. And maybe that's okay. Maybe you're fine saying, yeah, I'm okay letting this one die so that I can have a clear path to play, say, my Kara Morning Wife in the next turn. The other option is maybe you really don't want your opponent getting the life tap effect. Say you're very close to punching through for lethal, but you can't quite get there this turn, and you think you can get there next turn. If they have something big that they can put Biting Blade down on, well, it's good to respect it. It's not usually a good idea to say, I'm probably going to be able to find the damage next turn, and the Biting Blade won't matter. 9 times out of 10, it will. Biting Blade is one of the best catch-up tools in the game because it's a 3 mana way to give something life tap, and if they have something that either has Rush, something that's large on the board already and established, it can be a really hard thing to come back from if your opponent gets a big life tap swing like that. So how do we play around this? Well, you can prioritize trading into any of the creatures that your opponent might be able to put this down onto. If they have a minion that's, say, a 2/1 and you have, say, a 2/3, well, you could maybe try and punch that through with something by moving it to the side, maybe using your give an extra movement power and getting that 2 damage in now, but realistically, if you know they have the Biting Blade in hand, it's always the more responsible choice to just make the trade. You'll probably find the damage within the next couple turns, and then you can be really safe knowing that you don't let them have a comeback mechanic. They have to have a minion to play this on before it has any effect, so if you keep the board clear, especially if any of those larger threats, like maybe a Shatterfist, then they don't have a way back into the game, and you can squeeze them out over the course of a couple turns, instead of hoping you high roll and find lethal over the course of exactly 1 turn. But really, the big reason I wanted to bring up Biting Blade is specifically in purple is because they have a lot of item effects, and all of the items are revealed in your opponent's hand, just like Deported, and you really have no excuse not to play around them. Whenever you're making a play, take a look at your opponent's hand, see what's already revealed, and see how any of those cards could potentially affect your lines of play if they were to be used next turn. It's really important to take that time, look a turn ahead, and see what your opponent's going to be doing more so than just playing your own game. One of the best ways to go from beginner at a game to a little bit more advanced is to imagine what happens if you're your opponent. How do they play back? You're not just playing solitaire, right? This is a 2-player game. You're playing your own plan, but also you need to play in a way that minimizes the effects of your opponent's plan, and taking into account revealed cards and things you already know could happen is one of the best ways to accomplish that. And there we go, my vote for some of the most important cards to play around, 1 per color plus some sweepers. Let me know what you think. Have you played around these cards successfully in the past? Have you ever not played around them and really gotten punished for it? Leave a comment. Think there's something I missed? Another card that's really important to play around that you're seeing all the time? Also, let me know. You can either tweet at me, leave a comment here, or join us in the Mythgard and Team Rankstar Discords. Have a conversation, tell us your stories about playing around cards, and some of the horror stories about when you don't. So, if you enjoyed this content, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And until the next time, see you guys later.